here, and you may remember him from the Oddworld games. He has since moved on to creating a new movie called Citizen Siege, and who knows, we may see Oddworld movies out of him at some point in the future. Lorne, how you doing?
Doing great. How you doing?
I'm doing really well, gearing up here. March Madness starts today, this Thursday on the podcast, so we're really excited around here.
Nice. Excellent. In beautiful, Burbank, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's nice 70s. It's a nice time of year before it gets insanely hot in the next couple months here. So
yeah, we pretty much melt right on the basketball court.
Exactly.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
Lauren, you've been really quiet recently. Well, what's been going on?
Yeah, well, we kind of like it that way for now. It's been, it's really we're focused on a number of things, and all of those are sort of outside of the spectrum of things that we can really get into specifically and start talking about. Because there's a couple of reasons for that. One, you have obvious issues with but different scaled budgets and different industries and partners that want to keep things quiet. And then on another front, as soon as you start talking about something, then you got to answer all the press.
Yeah, they're funny like that.
Yeah, I don't want to do it, So we're just waiting, and when truth is, we're not in any hurry, and things are taking forever. It's just slow. Let me give you an example of how slow things can go. If we look at the Academy Awards for the last 2 years, every movie that was nominated for anything was in development from 4 to 7 years before it was actually greenlit.
Wow.
So that's Hollywood. The game industry is like you're typically just rolling over, big teams into one project and the next. But, film is just not that way. Unless you're one of the huge studios, it's just a very different beast.
How hard was it for you to adapt to that? That would drive me nuts.
Well, this is why we shut down the operation on the Central Coast, is that it would be impossible for us to deal with if we were trying to cover the overhead on a huge operation. Well, for us it was huge. Under 100 people, but that's a huge expense no matter how you slice it. So what we did was we prepared ourselves for the time that it was going to take. Not only to do a production, but the time to get greenlit fully into a production, and that's just an entirely different beast. So we prepared for that by basically reducing the overhead and focusing on the properties and stories first. There's a big difference between the game industry and the film industry and even the television industry. Not that we necessarily know this difference from watching the content that comes out on the back end, on our movie screen and on our television screen, but they really are all about story first. So the story is something that they'll tweak and tweak and tweak for years before they're willing to say yes, we're putting our we're fully greenlighting this into production. So that's a big difference from the game industry. The game industry is typically more of a technology and gameplay sale, right? And then if you got that, you can figure out how to wrap a good story around it. Whereas story comes first in these other mediums, which for us is very refreshing. It's a good time. We enjoy it.
So one of the things we're talking about a lot on today's show is kind of the whole process of concepting and everything you go through on that. What is that process like for you right now? How has that differed from concepting, a game or concept art for a game and concepting a story for a game? What are you doing differently for your movie?
Well, on the we've got a couple things. So one is the film that we're working on, which is the Citizen Siege property, and then we have another television event, sort of miniseries that is in active development as well. With some pretty exciting partners on that. So and then we have some other aspects of how we're looking at stretching beyond our own IPs. Oddworld has always been a company that's only dealt with basically, what I wanted to do, and then, was able to gather a lot of other people that wanted to do that as well. Whereas now we're looking more at pipeline infrastructures that are using game technology to deliver more things like film and television and episodics and things of that nature. And when we look at that, again, it comes back to story first. And where that's interesting and how it makes a difference with the character designs and your approach is that when you're designing for a game, you almost always are starting not so much with the idea, or at least historically, right? Things are changing today because of the compute power. But historically, you're starting with what's the technology capable of delivering, and what resolution can we manage, and then we'll sort of reverse engineer into a design solution for the characters. Whereas on the other front, now we're focusing almost primarily on exactly what suits the characters, the story, who these characters are. Why is that coming across most of all? And that gets you into a different sort of granular level of character design that we previously were really looking at in just our video clips, and then they would, as the game characters themselves, like we've all done, right? We just do as good a job as we can with the power that's there to get something presentable, that conveys some semblance of the character that was in the video clips and such. Whereas now it's all footage, so it's all about the saturation of those characters, and it approaches how we think about rigging differently. It approaches how we think about granularity and detail. And when you look at the current gen systems today, which we haven't been building for, PS3 and 360, you're getting pretty close where that's not so much your barrier anymore on a design front. It's not you're not governed by taking the extreme like we were in the PlayStation days, right? Where we all just had so many polygons and that was it. Who could do 100 polygons better?
Right.
And so we're transcending that space. But when the end goal is what is the audience going to think about this story, above and beyond how is the audience going to like this, X number of hours of gameplay, it just shifts your priorities from primarily focusing on functional data,
right,
to focusing on narrative data.
How hard has the shift been for you to get to that point? Has it been a struggle, or was it an easy transition?
Well, for us, I think the struggle was when we started making games, because we had started in film, so we kind of started on the character first front and then worked ourselves into games and then had to deal with the low resolution. So going back to this sort of idea of story first, has been really refreshing. It hasn't been a struggle at all. It's really refreshing because you take a lot of the sort of technological governors off of the design process. I mean, you're still using computer graphics, so you don't want to get too stupid with hair and flowing clothes and some of the normal, typical barriers. But beyond that, you can have a lot more freedom, and that freedom, hopefully adds up to richness in character as it comes off to the audience.
So, just touching on that for a second, you mentioned, the hair and the clothing and, in quote, stupid things like that or whatever. Let me ask you this. Like, when you look at games today, are people paying attention, or are developers paying attention to the wrong things from a graphic standpoint?
Well, I don't, when I look at, that's kind of a big statement, because the games industry has so many people building so many different flavors of things.
Sure.
And I think some do it, amazingly well, and then others, you wonder what they're doing. But, let's just take an obvious, like Gears of War, the resolution of the Gears of War characters, or Unreal Championship 3. Unreal Tournament 3, I think. The resolution of those characters is pretty great, right? I mean, there's other examples that are wonderful. If we look at, Assassin's Creed, there's a rich textural quality that transcends that barrier of making us feel like we're looking at a game. And in some ways, I think actually Assassin's Creed did one of the best jobs of that because the lighting is so awesome. It's not just that it's a lighting model, but the art direction, a lighting engine that's capable of doing wonderful things, but the art direction is really clever and it's very smart. And so to me it stands out at kind of the top of the heap. And also in ways that it hides its flaws, meaning, or I should say the technology limitations. So if we take Assassin's Creed as an example, and we say, well, it's a mysterious character who needs to cover his face anyway, right? So they give him a hood.
Right.
But it's really smart to give a guy a hood today, and still in a real-time game, because it's better that we don't see the imperfections that are inevitably still there. Right? So there's a really clever solution where we have near photoreal characters, but we're hiding some of the weaknesses that we're still delivering.
Sure.
Gears of War, our characters are all up front. They have astounding resolution in the scheme of things, but it reveals also how much we're not getting there because of the clarity of detail that we're just freely able to see at all times. If that answers your question, I might have veered off.
Yeah, no.
Feel free to correct me.
No. That's sort of what we were looking for. So
Excellent.
So, are you still kind of now? Like Oddworld was very, all the characters were very kind of exaggerated and different.
Yeah.
Are you going more realistic?
There's a few different properties that we're working on, right? So
right.
Let's just take, because we're familiar with Oddworld, let's take the Oddworld characters. So that film is something we've been designing for a while as well. And the characters that we know from the games and that were in those movies suddenly get to take a massive boost up in believable detail. Like all of a sudden, Sligs, you notice that they have hair. They have like pig's hair. That all of a sudden those little textural, wonderful things can come on. So the goofy quirkiness of them, whereas they were originally designed to sort of stand up next to Mario, right?
Right.
I mean, if we go back in the day to like at the beginning of when Insomniac was still doing Spyro and Naughty Dog was still doing Crash, we had come out with, that was basically the Abe generation as well. And there, we were still, our competition was still, the biggest successes were still Mario in 3D on a big banner at Best Buy or at Tower Records, or
right.
Like that was the target of character that meant the greatest success in video games at that time. And then Sonic, so there was this sort of almost cartoonish, quirky exaggeration, simplicity to the characters. And Oddworld was designing to get a little richer than that, a little more believable than that, but try and sustain the sort of proportion exaggerations that seemed very relevant for the market at that time, and very capable to be delivered as CG at that time affordably. So we're talking, we started working on Abe like 17 years ago. So when we look at, or not, yeah, maybe it was 16 years ago or so. So when we look at how that changes today with the new characters that we're designing, Oddworld was one that in its incarnation, at its core DNA from a design perspective, it was one where it was trying to match a quirkiness and just accelerate upon it a bit to still stay relevant to what the game industry was eating, the game market was eating at that time. And even though Oddworld may have seemed sort of a radical departure from what a lot of people were doing, in my mind it really wasn't, because Mario and Sonic had sort of set the bar. So how did we get more real without being as cartoony? That was the design objective for the Oddworld property. When we look at the Citizen Siege property, we're in an entirely different universe. And in that universe, then we get into much more grit. It's a much darker landscape. It's a much more politically potent, socially relevant story. It's sort of classic sci-fi meets Orwellian proportions, and it has a lot of relevance to where we are today. So all of a sudden, it's a far more human story, and it takes place in basically, future LA. So when we look at that as a design,
will future LA have less traffic, by the way?
Well, yeah, because no one can afford gas.
Okay, good. Cool. I'm riding a bike to work anyway, so it's all right.
Yeah, future LA will feel much more like old Shanghai.
Oh, great.
Oh yeah. Because when gas is $200 a gallon, everything's going to change. But so on that landscape, now we have a very gritty landscape that's very real and very relevant to where we are as people today, as global people today. And then we, as a design task, we still have to ask ourselves, what's the technological limitations to deliver these characters? What we still want to do them CG, but we want to do CG more clever. What do we care most about? Do we care most about being something like Beowulf, which, between us I found almost unbearable to watch. Going for a super hyper realistic, rendering of human people that can't act. It's like, what's the point? You're getting no expression. It just felt so stiff to me, right?
Don't talk about Angelina Jolie like that, though. Come on now.
Yeah, I think the real thing. But really, I didn't even finish watching the film because it just felt like a theme park ride. It felt like a story made to hit some technology bar, and a production, that was all about, I guess, releasing in 3D, and had all these other sort of needs throughout the production. It seemed that the heart of great storytelling just got lost, and part of that need that I think the director felt that he had to deliver, Zemeckis, was that he just wanted to achieve, kind of like what Final Fantasy the movie wanted to achieve. They just wanted to make it so real and for people to go, wow, I can't believe it's computer graphics. Well, I look at those things and I go, wow, who cares? I mean, who cares about your latest whiz-bang bullshit? No one really cares. What they care about is great stories and characters, right? So if the technology is there where we can render a face really realistically, but something's still a little bit wrong, something's still a little disturbing about its performance, it's a little stiff, then why don't we consider that that deficit and at a design level see how to turn it into a positive thing? How do we start to distort characters? How do we start to exaggerate expression? How do we take it that maybe borrows a little more from the best in manga, like Ghost in the Shell, like Blood, the Last Vampire, like where you really have this high fidelity of emotional expression just exploding through the characters. And so when we look at that as a where the technological barrier is still today, and I think Beowulf sets a great example of that we're not there yet, versus what can we be doing? I mean, why scan live actors and use them? I just look at that and I go, why? We're totally working ourselves back into a world that we've been trying to simulate and never been doing such a great job of ever, which is the real world. Well, we have this ability, if something's going to be 100% synthetic in its medium, like CG animated film or television series, we have this ability to suddenly, have a lot more freedoms. And that just doesn't mean with super goofy camera moves and impossible things that happen on the screen, but really, at a design level, what would express the most emotional communication to the audience in this character? And if that means her eyes have to be bigger and his should be too far apart and the facial distortions get closer to something like Sin City, like Marv, or, you know what I mean, where
right.
they're kind of human, but then they start taking on more expressions that start amplifying their character, because that's how I look at it. Like, when I look at the old spaghetti western movies, right, the Sergio Leone films, which had a lot of inspiration on Stranger, our game, but when I look at those, the casting just blows me away every time. Do you remember, like, Once Upon a Time in the West, or these films, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly?
Of course.
The casting is like, those were animated characters, right? They weren't so much like who would come into the Hollywood casting office as much as how was how was this director going around the world and just finding these faces? I mean, they were incredible. How does a guy like that ever get an acting job? I mean, some of them would be horribly ugly, others would be beautiful, others were just gross in different ways, or sunburned in ways that makeup could never achieve.
Right.
And so that's kind of gotten lost, right? We don't have that. Very rarely do we have that just sort of extreme casting that really comes through. Maybe a recent film like No Country for Old Men.
Mm-hmm.
Might have gotten closer to that, right? That was some grizzled-looking cast.
That's the word I was going to use. Yeah, absolutely.
But as soon as I watch a movie and I feel like I'm just watching the usual Hollywood actors that show up for the auditions in L.A., I see it already. I see the fabrication of it already. I see the lack of vision in it already. At least as an individual, in an individual entertainment consumer, that's what I feel. I feel like, man, this could have been so much greater in so many different ways. I mean, we look at the casting of Apocalypse Now, right? Like, it's just extreme characters. So I
think that was Lawrence Fishburne's first role too, wasn't it?
Yeah, I believe it was. Yeah, and so we just look at those faces in the greatest of films, and then we look at what everyone thinks is great faces to sell. Tom Cruise and other big actors and things like that. We go, well, okay. they've certainly earned their value. But if we're really talking about conveying emotional and story and narrative messages to an audience, what's the best possible face that could be beyond the human possibility of what comes out of our DNA? What can come out of the designer's DNA, that his mind, that adds to that sort of chemistry mix, and really it's sort of like gene splicing for a new generation of character design, because we're saying, well, what we really want is the best of what humanity has to offer, and then we want to turn up the volume knob on that to 11, right? We want to really start pushing that emotional component stronger. But then when we look at what our computer graphics is capable of delivering, how do we maximize that? So therein, I think, lies the sort of 21st century challenge to achieve right, which is proper exaggeration that amplifies the drama and the emotional connections without going so far that it becomes something obscure that we don't relate to.
So, a programming note here. Our interview with Lorne went really long, and we wanted to make sure it wasn't too much all at once, so we've split it into two parts. We'll have Lorne back with us next week. He'll talk a little bit more about Citizen Siege and give us